how many feel like right now is a calm in the storm? Because not me. But how many know this could be that? Couldn't it? In the midst of all that's going around us, couldn't we be trying to take a recess and have a calm in the midst of the storm? And much of this chapter was about how do we do that? Trying to figure out how, when things assail, when stuff comes against us, when the waves are crashing on the beach, what do we do to take calm in that moment? The hard part is that those things that come up, the fear, the anger, the jealousy, the struggle, the defensiveness, easily take over, don't they? So what kind of situation right now is causing that to arise the most in you? Those strong emotions that often take over how you react. What about the present moment is doing that to you?
It's the lack of our country working together to try to solve anything.
Yeah. The disconnection between different parts of us really is distressing, isn't it?
And the fear, the just tremendous fear.
Absolutely.
Everywhere.
Yeah. So much that feels like it's driving us further and further. And people trying to do that because of whatever they're facing. You're right. And that one of the biggest emotions that gives to me is a bewilderment that I don't know what to do with. How do I be present in the midst of that? Anybody else? What's causing those emotions for you?
Well, I was very sad to learn about how Congress is continuing to defund things that would help the firefighters, and they can't do their job if they don't have money. And yet the political climate is just against them.
Yeah. Well, and just that one word that you used, I think is a really good thing. That word against, anytime in whatever way we feel like something or somebody or, you know, some issue is against, it makes it really easy for all of those tough emotions to pop up, don't they?
Yep.
And to try to figure out what to do in that moment. Because I think we naturally go into that put up your dukes type of stance to try to say, how do I fight this moment, this thing? Anybody else?
For about a month and a half now, I've been dealing with this problem of numbness in my arm and hand, and not knowing exactly the cause, but the physical therapist seems to think it's related to muscle misalignment and muscle tension. And I'm just thinking that everything about this current situation is just causing so much tension in my back and my neck and my arm, and that's probably a lot of what's behind my physical ailments.
Yeah.
Is that just being, you know, in a state of heightened frustration and worry and so on, and helplessness. It's like you can't really, what can you do? So I'm really working hard on combating that.
Yeah, thank you, Doris. That stuff, and part of what I heard you say was that kind of unknown, unable to deal with well, you know, because you don't know exactly what's going on. That's tough to do, isn't it? You'd think you'd be really skilled at dealing with people that you don't understand living in your house. I'm sorry, Scott. but
that does come up once in a while.
But unknown, the unknown stuff, the ununderstandable is always hard for us, because how to confront it baffles us. And so we often go to less than effective things, and we know they're less than effective, but we don't know what else to do. So we get angry at something like that. We get depressed about something like that. And we know it's not quite going to solve it, but it feels like it's doing something. Right? Part of the reason why we do that is because we often have been unschooled in how to deal with it well. He talked a lot about distracting ourselves from the emotional work. How many of you learned in some way or another through your life, somebody taught you to distract yourself?
Oh, yeah.
And it's easy to do. It definitely takes some of that stuff and sets it aside, stores it in some kind of storage area. But it doesn't make it go away, does it?
Nope.
But we've done a whole lot of that type of dealing with things. And instead, what Thich Nhat Hanh is telling us is we need to bring our attention to it and bring it down to the solid space inside ourselves. Bring it to our abdomen. I love the metaphor that he told of the trees, right? The branches wave all over, but the base is solid, right? How do we get that stuff down into the solid space? You don't do it by forgetting about it, by storing it out of your memory, out of your thoughts. You get it by looking at it and drawing it in and recognizing it for what it is. How many know that most of those times when you are feeling the powerful emotions, the anger emotions, the sadness emotions, the fear emotions, that there's a basis for it. Maybe not a basis you can do anything about, but you can connect to it. And overlooking it doesn't do that. That's just a out of sight, out of mind, but it doesn't solve anything. What he says to do is to draw it into yourself and deeply have it with you. That's part of what meditation is about. It's about being in that space where you're resting in your most solid space instead of staying on the level of the intellect. And by the intellect, I don't just think he's thinking, let me think about it. It's all that stuff where we're trying to do something, fix something, instead of just being present with something. What do you do that helps you to do that? What practices do you have in place? Yes, Mary.
Well, I've talked about this before, but meditation, yoga, exercising are all things that kind of, when I'm feeling really anxious, which I do have anxiety issues and depression issues, I feel like those things really help me a lot.
Nice. Nice. Anyone else?
I go to my easel and paint, and I'm lost
Nice.
completely.
Yeah. Who else?
I hesitate to say this because I agree that it's necessary to face these issues and not dismiss them or put them aside or hide from them. But ultimately, I think I reframe them in a much larger context. I remember a story about a little black boy that asked his grandfather, he says, "Grandpa, you've been through so much." And he went through a recital of all the bad stuff his grandfather had seen and encountered. And he says, how come you still happy and smile and all that? And grandfather replied from a kind of a mistranslation in the King James Version. Well, son, he says, the Bible say things don't come to stay, they come to pass.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really look, I mean, ultimately we're all part of eternity.
Yeah.
And whatever's happening now, what personal distress in my body or on the national scene,
Yeah.
somehow it's in a far larger framework. And so I simply don't get as upset. I feel more like an observer than a participant.
And that's especially what he tries to talk about, I think, in the second section, where he talks about an emotion is just, the second part of this chapter, an emotion is just an emotion.
Yeah.
And do we remember that? Because in the moment, it feels all consuming in some ways.
Yeah.
Right? And so part of what we're doing here is just resting and sitting in a spot where in the midst of all of that real, whatever it happens to be, we stop to say, but it's just an emotion. It's just a thing that can pass. So I want us to take a couple minutes, and part of what he says is to be in that space of just quiet. And rather than have you just be quiet, I'm going to lead you through a meditation that they have in the back of the book. It's called the Metta Meditation, and they subtitle it, May We Be Free from Fear. And it's a very simple thing where we get into a calm space, and then we just repeat something to be able to help us. So it's just 3 lines. It says, may I be peaceful, happy, and light in body and spirit. May I be safe and free from injury. May I be free from fear, anxiety, anger, and afflictions. And so rest in that spot. Calm your body. Calm your breathing. And as I recite this aspiration to you, repeat it inside of yourself and calm your heart and your spirit. May I be peaceful, happy, and light in body and spirit. May I be safe and free from injury. May I be free from fear, anxiety, anger, and affliction. May I be peaceful, happy, and light in body and spirit. May I be safe and free from injury. May I be free from fear, anxiety, anger, and afflictions. May I be peaceful, happy, and light in body and spirit. May I be safe and free from injury. May I be free from fear, anxiety, anger, and affliction. Repeating that won't solve everything. You're still in the class with Pastor Jim. It didn't quite go away, did it? But it allows us to then be in that other space better. Emotions have power. The question we're asking is, do we let them have power over us? Or do we use the power of those emotions in a different way? Do we keep ourselves in a different relationship to them? They are strong. That's part of the reason why we have to let them in. We need to deal with them. We need to know and see them. Because if we don't, like you said at the end of the chapter, it will explode in some way or another, won't it? And what we're trying to do is use those emotions to have with a good relationship to them instead of the other way around. ultimately, so that we drop into the second aspect of meditation, not just the stopping and calming, but the looking deeply in order to transform, to change. And it's not just change the emotion. It's not just change Ed, no matter how much he needs to be changed.
No.
Right? It's also transforming ourselves and our view of all of those things. Right? Trying to look and be in a different relationship to all of that. So the second half of that meditation is where they begin to say, not may I be, but may he be, may she be, may they be. And it draws us into those spaces where we begin to go outward. As we go into the second chapter, he began to talk about the knife inside of us. And how many have one of those knives that often cut and slash and poke and do things, either to you or you pulling it out and using it against others? And instead, what we're trying to do is take that knife and set it aside so it neither cuts us nor becomes a weapon that we use against the others. So when was it that you last used the knife inside of you? How is it that slashing happened because of that knife? And how do we make it so that we don't get into that space again? How many have at least one person that would feel really nice to use that knife against them in some way? Anybody?
Yeah, our president.
Yeah, the president.
Yeah.
I had an experience in the last week with someone who's a friend. Maybe an acquaintance is maybe a better description of the relationship. And I was really shocked to hear some of her comments about racism and about where the country is and the demonstrations. And I was upset and I got angry with her and I started arguing with her. And suddenly it was like, I just had to stop and say, let's just stop the conversation. It really surprised me how vested I was in having my perspective and my understanding be hers, and it isn't that way. And I had misevaluated where she was, and it was really unpleasant.
Yeah.
And that's all a reflection of how I feel about our president and what he's doing. And it was very disturbing. And let me just say, I've been hearing about this book that was written by his niece, and some of the things that she wrote in this book. It's coming out Tuesday, but everybody seems to, at least in the media, has a copy of it. And she describes in depth the kind of treatment he received as a child. And I'm thinking about, as I was reading this section, I'm thinking about him and how this applies to him. And because my struggle, and I'm sure everybody's struggle, is how do I see him in a peaceful way? How can I see him in a healing way so that I'm not contributing to the insanity of our lives?
But how many have the difficulty of somebody in your life, like the president, who doesn't seem to be helping very much in moving towards that peaceful spot?
Oh, yeah.
And so when that other person seems to be actively trying to gash with the knife inside of them, it's hard not to pull out your own weapon in defense, isn't it?
Right.
Or
And
in
you can use it
retaliation.
somebody else, against somebody else, who
Absolutely
is
right.
kind of line them up.
Absolutely right. So we can always feel very justified when we respond that way. It doesn't make it better for us or for them. right?
It's painful.
It is.
Right.
And the more we see that other person as a person to fix, and believe me, there's a lot of fixing that needs to be done, right? I'm not trying to say that that's not there, but the more we see that first, the easier it is to respond in some type of violent way, trying to cut out something of them, trying to stop something that they're doing wrong. But when we do that, part of the Thich Nhat Hanh's point is that we're not recognizing why it is that they are who they are. Something of the reason why they're pulling out the knife inside of them is because of some of the suffering that's going on in them. Now, from my perspective, it may be irresponsible suffering, unreasonable suffering, drawing conclusions that don't make sense. But it doesn't change the fact that there is hurt, and that person is trying to express that hurt, however imperfectly they're doing it. And if I attack them back, they don't face the hurt, do they? They only get hurt more. So how do we not become, as he said, a terrorist? Being mindful about our work, being mindful of the words we use, the things that are hurting others. And sometimes some of the people that I deal with, they say things in such a way that it's really easy just to tease a little bit more hurt out of them. It's not hard at all. And that's not helpful. It's a kind of terrorism, he says. And we create even more people with knives in their hearts, which means it's going to be harder and harder for them to love. And thus harder and harder for us to love them. When have you learned that you had the wrong perception of somebody else? When was it that you came up against something and you just knew what was true, and all of a sudden you figured out that it was different? Do you remember one of those moments? Yes, go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, I think it happens often to all of us, more often than we probably want to admit. And I think it's when we don't know somebody very well, or we make that assumption, and there's that old saw about assuming makes an ass of you and me. And I think it's true. And it's about seeing people as they really are, and it's about listening, not just with your ears, but with all of your senses to another. And I'm struck by how often we, I like being proven wrong. Actually, it's rather a relief sometimes to know that I jumped to a conclusion and now I can jump out of it and into another space with someone. And I think it's just about willing to be truthful and willing to be very honest with what we're experiencing, but willing to see differently, and in the moment. And I think I get chances like that a lot of the time, and it's always based on maybe seeing somebody as a reminder of the past, as opposed to being in the present moment.
Right.
And that's sort of insidious when we do that, because that person doesn't even know our past connection, because of something about them reminds me of somebody else. And we immediately go in our mind to well, he or she must be like so-and-so or like that situation, and that's not even fair.
Yeah.
So I certainly have lately been getting opportunities to reflect and change my mind.
Well, Catherine, as I'm looking at everybody else's face, I'm seeing that none of them did that same thing like you. You're the only one that had that mistake.
Well, I'm glad that I could be the only one to have that mistake. So I'd like to know which ones they're making. Must be something good.
Catherine, I really appreciate how well you understood that insight and all. Unfortunately, I think this way I see it most is with my partner, Becky.
Mm.
I tend to frame her actions, and the story I tell about them has to do with a problem I had in infancy. My mother was trained. My mother was totally reliant on outside advice, and back then the advice of pediatricians was never spoil your child. Feed them on a strict schedule, diaper them on a strict schedule, never pick them up when they cry. And so I felt abandoned, and that nobody ever listened to me, and nobody cared. And so that's the story I tend to snap on. Anything that I can interpret that way pops up. And that's been a struggle with me of reframing the whole story when I'm listening to Becky or anybody that is a situation that feels threatening to me in that sense.
Yeah. But see, that was his very first point in the whole chapter, is that if we keep the fear out of sight, unacknowledged, then we don't even begin this process. And you're right, that the first thing we have to do is see that we are reacting out of some framing, some story, some idea that isn't completely true. And so to draw that fear in and look at it for what it is and what it's causing in us.
Mm-hmm.
Both the accurate nature of it, but maybe more importantly, the inaccurate nature of it. Where is it telling me a lie about life, about myself, about that other person facing me? Because those lies, we believe them emotionally, probably even deeper than intellectually. And we believe those things so well that it's hard for us not to react that way. But if we confront it and we say, no, there's something different, something more.
Jim, I'd like to speak again, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I think it might be germane. I just, and I'm not doing true confessions today, but I recently became aware when I was on my vacation that I have a real serious issue with anger and rage. And it's long-standing, and I've never even been able to talk about it, much less do anything about it. And I see where that, crops up. Usually it's in secret. Usually other people don't even know about it. But I think it needed to be identified, and so it happened in a context where I outed myself and was just appalled and ashamed and quite perturbed. But out of that, what I recognized is that I needed help. And I went to my doctor. I put myself on medication. I'm going to see a therapist for anger management. And I'm trying to just look at myself in a holistic way. What are all the things that I can do to treat myself right and to grapple with this and deal with it in an open and honest way. And so I'm sharing because I think we often have secret things that we can't even acknowledge, much less deal with. And I'm thankful I'm thankful to be able to deal with it now.
Yeah. But I think what you're saying, Catherine, is that that type of thing is a key to unlocking all of this.
I think so.
Do we just react out of, or do we question and deal with why we are doing that?
Right.
And thank you for doing that work. That's essential work if we're going to ultimately not just help ourselves, but be present for those around us. Is to be
Exactly.
honest about how we're reacting to them.
Well, interestingly enough, it was my granddaughter who said something to my son, who said something to me. Maybe grandma needs to see about getting some medication.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very powerful. She's 15 and a half.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I take things wherever they come from, and I don't question the source. I know that it's from God.
Yeah.
You know, I relate to what you're saying, and it's so much easier to hide anger and rage when I label them as being bad and that I'm bad.
Mm.
And what I've learned is that I need to be gentle with myself about that whole issue of how I act or how I feel, and not make bad judgments about myself, but just be present with it, as opposed to not being gentle with myself.
Sure.
So
The more messages of good girls always or bad boys do, or any of those kinds of messages that are coming up aren't really being helpful as much as we think. But our past is strewn with those kinds of ultimatums that are given to us that say this is always true, and it's just not always true.
Well, I think as a society, I think unfortunately many of us have not, our families did not deal with anger very well, and it was present in our homes, but people had rituals and they had scripts always, and nothing ever got resolved out of that. And so I don't think I have a very good model for dealing with anger in a healthy manner.
Right.
And that's what I'm going to be looking for. And I feel so much more peaceful now that it's out, because of all the secrets I've held. This probably is one of the key things, is unacknowledged about rage and anger that probably goes back to when I was a fairly small child and felt very unable to deal with the world I found myself in.
And it's not just the anger itself, it's also the way to deal with the anger, the way that you express it. I was watching an old Western the other day with Buster Crabbe, right?
It really was an old one, but God.
Yeah, and Buster Crabbe's sidekick is Fuzzy, right? So Buster gets into a fight, and they're tearing up the bar, these two, and one of the buddies of the guy that Buster is fighting is standing next to the bar and begins to reach for his gun, and Fuzzy reaches over and says, "No, boys need to fight sometimes." And so the solution that fighting has to happen is something that is built into. I mean, that type of movie was not an uncommon movie to watch. That type of story was not an uncommon story to be told. And so boys of that generation grew up with that as a message underneath there. And is it still the message that's the right message? And how do we change that messaging inside our own heads? Is that the right solution too? All of those wrong perceptions, either about yourself or about that other person, are important for us to examine and change. And the only way they can do that is through love and compassion. Right? You can't change fear by picking up a bigger weapon. You have to change fear by having compassion. Being with, compassion, you know what it literally means, right? With the suffering. How can you be in the suffering that needs to be there, and for you, in order for you to be honest about it? How can you be with the suffering of the other person That one who is also expressing some kind of anger and it feels like it's directed at you. What is it that's causing them to struggle in this moment? And that's when he begins talking about compassionate, deep listening, which is a time-consuming thing and a too often a shut your mouth thing, even in the midst of whatever they say that is just stupid or ignorant or completely against you. How do you listen?
I have something to relate and a little exchange with a guy that I went to college with. And he's been someone I've struggled with a little bit because of his work in energy and mining and the way he's discounted in the past sustainable energy, you know? And then there's another button that kind of came together in a recent exchange that I had with a posting on Facebook that he did. And that's I do a lot of bicycle riding, and I often feel a button kind of pressed when there's criticism of cyclists in various ways, even if the things that they're criticizing are legitimate and don't necessarily apply to me, I tend to react. So he did this posting about, he lives in Denver, and that he went up in the Boulder area and didn't see any development of wind turbines. And there was a discussion about how that's one of the windiest sections of the country. And he said, well, it's one of the windiest places in Colorado. He said, the Boulder Greenies just don't want any of those monster turbines near their bike paths. So, you know, I was thinking about how I responded, if at all. And what I finally said back to him was, maybe bicycle power generators is the solution for Boulder, especially in the winter when it's too cold to ride outdoors, an ecological fitness gym. And his response back was, actually not a bad idea. Let's see, 2 12-hour shifts of 100,000 of Boulder's bicycling enthusiasts could easily exceed the intermittent generation from some of Xcel's wind farms, like one that he mentioned. But I was surprised at the positive response and how that conversation turned into something different from the pointing out each other's wrong thinking.
Yeah. The hard part is, I don't know about you, Scott, but sometimes what's wrong about the other person is just so easy to see. And it's just so easy to point out. Yes, Judy.
I worked with teachers who worked with vulnerable populations for a while, and especially with abused children. And I did a lot of working with them on how to teach children of abuse, both physical, emotional, sexual, whatever. And it was to get them to wrap their heads around the fact that you cannot ask a child of abuse to abandon their negative behaviors, which have sustained them, kept them alive up to that point, unless you replace it with something that is just as effective and more positive. And it was like, I had so many teachers coming and go, wow, I'd never even, it's like, they'd never even thought along those lines of how to get into the headspace, because abused kids were hypervigilant. And I know with me, I had to work extremely hard because I'm very hypervigilant. And if I detect the slightest note of anger towards me, I will shut you off. I mean, and I'm not talking about even anger, just the slightest. I had to work with myself really hard to get to the point where I didn't just isolate myself from any kind. I mean, things that to you would be totally innocuous. Let me give one example. Okay, I belonged to the Racket Club back in 3 lifetimes ago. And this gentleman came up to me and he goes, "You're this wonderful Amazon woman." Well, I took that to mean I was a big hulking woman. And I took it very negatively and I blocked him off. And luckily he came and talked to me later and he said, "I really meant that as a compliment." And we had a discussion about it. But I realized I immediately go to the negative towards me, not the positives.
Mm-hmm.
But to work with people to get them past, to see past their own, what's happening in their own little heads, especially with children who are abused. And I'm not talking to be severe abuse sometimes. It can be just, and every child has some abuse in their life. So of some kind. And so it's like how to deal with that, how to get past your own head and past your shutting down when things overwhelm you.
Yeah. In the meditation that I use, which I will send it to you, it is digital. At the end of this, the author says, "Finally, look at your consciousness. According to Buddhism, consciousness is like a field with every possible kind of seed in it. Seeds of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, seeds of anger, fear, and anxiety, and seeds of mindfulness. Consciousness is the storehouse that contains all these seeds, all the possibilities of what might arise in your mind. Meditation can bring the seeds of peace, joy, and love up into your conscious mind as zones of energy and transform the seeds of fear." So it's work, Judy, to try to say in that moment, yep, this is true, but how do we help this other seed grow in the moment? And it's hard because we all have whatever's been planted and has grown up in us already. But how do we help plant that? The problem is, if you're like me, you want that plant to grow up really quick in the other person. I want it now, not, at the end of the growing season. And for that, we have to have some patience with each other, right? Leave some time for each other to get to that space.
Well, I had a conversation a couple of days ago with my sister, and the very first thing she pointed out was how protesters are busy spreading the virus. And it was so interesting that she chose them as the cause of the virus, rather than Republican refusal to wear masks or anything else. But this is all you expect if somebody watches only Fox. And there's no way I could argue with her on these things. This is what she's saturated in, and my brother-in-law. And so the only response I know how to make to something like that is recognize that this is what they've been marinated in. Of course, that's going to be her response. And I can't come from a place of being right and her being wrong.
Yeah.
I want to be right.
Yeah.
My-
And you may be,
Somebody says, would you rather be right or happy? And when I've asked that question by others, I'm happy when I'm right.
Yeah.
And that, but to generally be happy with her and with myself, I have to understand that's a natural outcome of the kind of place that she's been sitting in. And in a loving way, all I can do is say, you know, I've been find some a way of understanding and being compassionate with that kind of understanding that she has.
yeah.
Finding a way not to attack it, but to share from another place in a non-threatening way.
Yeah. The problem is when you attack it, it rarely feels like love. Even if from your heart, it's trying to be love, you know, and you're trying to help that person in a loving way, it rarely feels like love. And when you try to use the second thing that you were talking about, the compassion, the understanding, then it doesn't always change the person, but at least it provides a more fertile ground for that growth rather than the first.
Yeah. Well, I think all I can do is demonstrate, and she's coming from a place of attack, blame, and such.
Yes.
I have to come from a different place and illustrate that there's another way of living and another attitude instead of responding in kind.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of, okay, so from my background, Mormon pioneers crossing across the plains, right? If there was any issue, they would circle the wagons, as pioneers often did, right? And much of the Mormon story tells a story of being attacked and circling of wagons emotionally and institutionally. And I think that's often where they come from. And so attack is rarely the right way to be able to be in relationship, because they will put up the walls of defensiveness. And I do think you're facing the very same thing, Ed. There's a lot of defensiveness that quickly goes up right now in America. And at least part of our job is to try not to trigger the circling of the wagons, right? So are we the angry hordes charging against them, or are we something different that allows them to see us as maybe unknown and strange still, but not an enemy? Go ahead.
It's has always seemed to me, because I've learned this, I think, from Doris and Scott, that the best approach is to see where you can agree on values, on on the things that you love or the things that are important, and shift that whole shape of the conversation. And sometimes that's really not really hard to do, and sometimes it's really easy to get to, because underlying where I see, this is the way I see to get to the right result, like what Ed was saying. I see that, but that's not going to get me anywhere. Where I need to be is we have the same goal.
Yeah.
And and talk about that, and then see how we can diffuse and come to some place of respect. Right. Or something.
Right.
With thanks to Scott and Doris.
Yeah.
So I want us to go back into that space of meditation, that meta meditation. And meta means loving kindness. So that's what we're trying to do, is be in a space of loving kindness towards ourselves. And I'm going to repeat the same type of things like I already said, but this time, instead of aiming them towards ourselves and say, may I be peaceful, happy, and light, we're going to aim them towards. And so find that quiet spot, stir your, calm your body, calm your breathing, and then be in the space of this aspiration, not for yourself, but for others. May she be peaceful, happy, and light in body and spirit. May he be peaceful, happy, and light in body and spirit. May they be peaceful, happy, and light in body and spirit. May she be safe and free from injury. May he be safe and free from injury. May they be safe and free from injury. May she be free from anger, afflictions, fear, and anxiety. May he be free from anger, afflictions, fear, and anxiety. May they be free from anger, afflictions, fear, and anxiety. And just the being in that spot and repeating those words over and over again, I think is going to help us to some degree put away those thoughts of these people that aren't wearing a mask. I hope they just catch coronavirus. Right? Because that's an easy other prayer to have, isn't it? That type of prayer. And we don't want to have that prayer. We know we don't want to have that prayer. And so trying to transform that fear about them into this which says, I'm searching for the best for them, will transform not necessarily how they act, but it will transform how we act towards them.
Oh, yeah.
Won't it?
Yeah.
Because I think those other things that we do, those are not wrong so much as they're not helpful. Right? They're not helping us. They're not helping the other person. They're not helping the distance between us. They're not helping the fear. And this type of thing, this approach transforms that, or has the potential to, doesn't it?
It was interesting. I felt much more in tune with this in praying for directing this to someone else.
Yeah.
Earlier, I felt, well, I feel safe. I feel, I mean, that was a Buddhist approach to dissolving fear, but I come from a sense of the reality of God, and that's the only ultimate reality, and there could not be anything but safety, and that I'm always in a safe place, and I'm always protected, and everything that's happening is somehow for my good. And so I don't seem to have that sense of fear, but it's not because I'm trying to erase my fears, as the prayer seemed to be working for me earlier, but that I can trust. I don't have to worry.
Yeah, yeah. But that's the sense of drawing it in, resting it in the abdomen, the strongest part of you, and allowing that fear not to be the enemy that you fight against or run from, but to make it into something very different. The knife inside of you is always easy to reach for.
Oh yeah.
But it always will hurt either you or the other or both, right? The question is, can we, at one point he says that we can transform, we can take that knife away so that the heart becomes the bridge. Wonderful different metaphor, isn't it? How is it that we relate to that other person? With the knife in hand or with the bridge between us? Hopefully we can feel the divine calling us to that second. Good luck this week dealing with whatever will come up against you, whoever will come up against you. Because it is not simple doing this.
Oh, no.
But it can be such a blessing in life, can't it? Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Tim.
All right.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
You.
Thank you.
Okay.
then. Leave.